Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, a new grassroots organization called Project Ontario believes progressive Conservative Premier Doug Ford isn't nearly conservative enough.
Premier Ford was also in damage control mode this week after saying some controversial things about First Nations. He did apologize, but we will be looking at the after effects.
The Toronto Transit Commission has been given the keys to the Eglinton LRT. Does that mean a fall opening date might actually happen?
And in your column, my column, I'll talk about how Ford isn't the only one with critics in his own party. Bonnie Crombie is facing them too.
And I've written about the events of 40 years ago this week, when one of the world's longest-lasting political dynasties came to an end.
It's Friday, June 20th, 2025, so let's get to it.
JMM.
Sir?
Little sugar for starts? You're wearing a Canada Goose today. I'm not sure why.
The Wawa Goose again. I like this T-shirt, and I decided to wear it again.
I think you need to start putting more focus and more priority on coming up with new and fascinating T-shirts for me to get interested and excited about, because I don't want to start seeing repeats already.
What else is this job for, if not
to impress me with your T-shirt collection?
T-shirts.
I agree. I'm going to. Tina, can we get a shot of this over here? This is me today. This is Frank Miller, and I'm not telling you why I'm wearing Frank Miller yet. You're going to have to let the suspense linger, because we're going to come to it later.
Right, but we are going to mention that if you are listening to this on your phone or watching on YouTube at home, you are getting the podcast a little bit later than usual, and that is because you, sir, were actually at my alma mater this week. You were speaking at TMU.
That is true. I gave a little speech at Toronto Metropolitan University yesterday at their convocation. 600 students, I think, in the audience at what they used to call Maple Leaf Gardens, now the Mattamy Athletic Center. And fascinating. I'm actually going to write a column in the future about what I saw yesterday, because it was both fascinating and disturbing for some other reasons. So I think that conflict makes for an interesting story.
Well, I graduated from, it was then called Ryerson University in 2009, so mumble years ago. So I can only assume that the student body has substantially improved since I left.
I don't know about that. And that's one of the things I want to write about.
All right.
Anyway,
well,
we'll get back to that more. Yeah, more on that later. In the meantime, shall we get on with the show?
Let's go to it.
Off to issue one. Project Ontario is a new grassroots organization that believes the Ontario PC Party under Doug Ford has lost its conservative bona fides. They think it's time for a course correction. Conversely, PC Party insiders say the movement's beliefs are far outside the province's mainstream. Joining us now to discuss just how outside he is or isn't, here's Matthew Spoke, one of the founders of Project Ontario. Matthew, welcome to our little table here at onpoli. And why don't we just start with why you think you need this initiative right now?
Well, maybe I'll start by just correcting some of the language. This is quite an informal gathering of people with ideas. I wouldn't frame us as an organization or necessarily a movement. And I don't want this to be a discussion around Doug Ford personally, or specific decisions this province has made. I think what sort of got us together was a frustration that there's just a sense of missed opportunity in the province. We've had a PC government now for coming up on 7 years, and we're looking at what are the list of accomplishments that we could be proud of as movement conservatives in the province. And our intent is really just to put ideas out into the mainstream and have them debated. I mean, this is not intended to be a divisive split within the movement. It's really to just surface ideas that we think merit some discussion. And that's sort of what got this together. So there's a number of us that are starting to contribute, by writing policy pieces, generally framed around areas that we think the province could take action. I think a really great outcome for us would be to see this government actually take some of our ideas and run with them. So
how many are you right now, do you think?
There's about 8 of us contributing in the background. I'll say that we've spoken to dozens of people that are, affiliated in one way or another with this sort of movement, either within government or, formerly within government, or people within the think tank world, the government relations world, even just entrepreneurs that, that's sort of where I come from in this world, where there's a general sense that we could be doing more, that Ontario is a province that could be leading the country in many respects. And we're frustrated to see sort of our standings on many rankings.
So you launched with, among other things, an essay on the hub, and the reaction has not been uniformly positive among some of your conservative friends. So we have a clip here of Doug Ford's ex-director of communications, Larissa Waller, about what she had to say.
Great.
There's a batch of conservatives that would like to be ideologically pure in their personal definition of what it means to be a conservative, and they think that they own that definition, and they would rather lose and not form government and, go to sleep at night thinking that they're right and everybody else is wrong.
She also wrote a column where she said Ontarians are backing a version of conservatism, under the current government that is, quote, modern and realistic, while the vision that you and your colleagues are laying out would, quote, shrink the definition of conservatism into something rigid and unworkable and, frankly, unelectable. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, firstly, that we have a bunch of areas of policy that we want to start elaborating on that we haven't yet done. So, all that we've put out into the public realm is really an introductory piece of the fact that we intend to talk more about ideas. And we're going to follow up with that on that piece with policy pieces on healthcare, on education, on housing, on economic growth and productivity, on public safety, and we may go beyond that. Our objective with these pieces is really to start conversations within the movement, not to be seen as contrarians to the current government. I think there are areas of policy that we could point to that we think the Ford government has done a reasonably good job, but our general observation is that there have been missed opportunities. And when I look at the legacy of previous premiers, you often find that after they leave office, they start listing out the regrets of the things that they didn't do while they had the chance to do it. We've now been governing for 7 years in this province. That won't last forever. One day, the opposition will get their act together and they will dethrone the PCs. And we'll look back and say, oh, wouldn't it have been nice if we had accomplished this list of things that we never got around to?
So give us an example. What's something that you believe your Project Ontario would focus on in a way that's different from the current government?
Well, I guess I'd frame it as, where if we look at statistics that rank us on important metrics and, quality of life or economic productivity or housing starts and completions or healthcare wait times, you go down the list across major policy areas, and we are not leading the country, let alone the developed world, in many respects. I mean, productivity in Ontario has flatlined for a decade. Housing starts are now at the lowest in the country.
We know all this. What do you want to do about it?
Yeah, so I don't want to get ahead of. I'm not the only one contributing policy pieces, so I don't want to dive into one specific area of policy. But I think there are steps that could be taken by a provincial government that require some courage, that are not necessarily always going to be the most politically popular policy prescription to a problem. But when you have a third majority term, it sort of seems like the opportunity to take risks and to...
One example, Matt.
Sure.
One example of one thing you do differently from the current Ford government, which would be more in line with what you'd like to see happen.
Well, I'll speak to one area that I know better than most, just because I work in housing and real estate development. On housing, we've now had 3 consecutive ministers of municipal housing municipal affairs and housing that have promised meaningful reforms to how housing gets approved in the province. Many of those reforms have either not taken place or have been very, very slow to move as we've watched the statistics sort of go in the wrong direction on housing starts. So land use policy, development charges, things that the province is now talking about that we're encouraged by. I'll hold my judgment until I see sort of like formal policy getting put forward in the House. But we think there's a lot more that could be done on the taxes and the land use reforms that would allow for more types of housing getting built faster across the province. So that's one area that I could speak to with some specific knowledge.
When you've laid out the vision in that hub piece, you also mentioned affordable housing, you mentioned childcare, strong healthcare and education systems. These are things that the current government says they want too. They are spending money in large sums to deliver some of these things. So how do you see a Conservative government more to your liking doing those differently?
Well, let me take healthcare childcare as an example, and this, again, an area that I focus on quite a bit. My wife owns a French preschool in Toronto. It's a policy area that's obviously been very impactful to daycare and preschool operators over the last couple of years as federal and provincial policy has shifted that industry towards a more subsidized system. And I think there's a lot of merit to putting federal and provincial dollars behind making sure families have access to childcare. The way it's been rolled out has been very much at the expense of small business owners and small business operators. In many cases, micro businesses. My wife's preschool is 24 kids learning French in Toronto. And she's now met hundreds of operators across the province that have felt squeezed by policies that have just been miscalibrated. Not that the intents are incorrect, not that the broad policy objective is misguided, but that the implementation could have been done significantly better. On that one in particular, there's obviously a dynamic where it needs to be negotiated with the federal government, where the funding is coming from. But as a simple point of pet peeve, there is no means test in terms of who gets access to a subsidy for childcare in this province. Meaning, wealthy families that were already in childcare centers are now getting discounts while lower income families are waiting on wait lists. And I think there is very obvious policy solutions to that as an example, right? So on healthcare, we've talked a lot about this as a movement for decades now. Coming out of the pandemic, it seemed like there was, for a very brief window of time, public support for meaningful reform in our healthcare system. The healthcare system showed signs of fragility through COVID-19 that we all saw firsthand, ICU beds and other things. Wait lists for primary care physicians, wait lists for specialists continue to go up across the province. And not that this is uniquely an Ontario problem, this is a Canadian problem, but generally speaking, relative to our peers, we tend to perform worse. And we're unwilling to, try alternative approaches. Even within the context of a single payer system, we think there are ways that we could be innovating on service delivery that would move the needle a lot more quickly.
There are always dangers when people within the same family bring these discussions, these debates, into the public realm.
Yes.
The people who are in certainly prefer these conversations to happen behind closed doors so that you all look like a beautiful, united front.
Yeah, of
and
course.
Clearly, there are some chinks in the armor here. So the question becomes, are you concerned that some Conservatives will look at what you're attempting to do, well-intentioned as it is, as being disloyal?
I mean, I'm not a spokesperson for the party in any official capacity. I would consider myself a loyal conservative, small c, both at the provincial and federal level. But I generally get motivated by ideas, and what frustrates me about the official apparatus is when it is not convening discussions on ideas, then we are not actually improving the strength of our movement. I think we have benefited from a relatively weak opposition over the last several elections. I think it's led to good electoral outcomes. I don't think that we can rely on that as a strategy forever. And I think if we don't look to a governing track record as the purpose to be a political party is not only to win elections, it's to actually implement change that aligns with your ideology. And I think there are ways to do that. I mean, I'll go back to Ms. Waller's clip. I don't think what we are proposing is an ideological purity test. I think we're proposing very pragmatic things that in many respects have public support. To me, the risk is not debate. The risk is complacency. Our opponents are going to get stronger. They're going to get better organized. They're going to eventually see an opportunity to dethrone the current government. And we get weak by not challenging ourselves on policy ideas.
There was a phrase used in that Hub essay. You called for a renewed state capacity, and this is a phrase that I've seen a lot of Conservatives in the U.S. use, and I'm intrigued to see it make its way north of the border. But maybe if you could, for our audience, define what you mean by state capacity and why you think it's important.
Well, and so Ms. Waller actually, I think this morning, in fact, published a piece on sort of a critique of what we're up to at Project Ontario. And one of the things she pointed to was the track record of the Ford government on infrastructure. And I think infrastructure is one of these areas where they have a lot to talk about. They're building Highway 413, they're building the Ontario line, they're promising, the Eglinton LRT. We can talk about that from many angles.
We're going to talk about it later, don't you worry.
I'd say I'm encouraged that we now have a government that is prioritizing infrastructure, particularly in the city of Toronto. We should really never stop building infrastructure in this city. I think there is a view that we could be doing these things more efficiently. I will take infrastructure versus no infrastructure, but if we're going to build infrastructure, I'd rather it be done cost efficiently and on schedule and in a way that sort of matches what peer nations around the world might spend for similar infrastructure, and that is not the case. So that would be an example of state capacity. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what Ontarians expect from their government is that the services and infrastructure projects that we need are delivered to us, but they're delivered to us with respect for taxpayer dollars. And so, all else being equal, I'm glad the Ontario line is getting built. I'm glad the Eglinton LRT will one day see the light of day. I wish these things were done, on a faster and tighter budget. And I think that's a pretty fundamental pillar of conservatism is just fiscal responsibility with taxpayer money.
But another part of conservatism, at least how conservatives have governed, has not really been friendly necessarily with the idea of a active and competent public service, if I can put it that way, right? Like a Metrolinx that was competent and energetic enough to deliver the crosstown on time and on budget might also be competent enough to say that a tunnel under the 401 is not a great idea. And, that is, to my mind, that is where the tension with conservative politics has always arrived, where, whether you want to talk about Stephen Harper or Doug Ford or his late brother as mayor, there's at least a suspicion of public service where there isn't outright antagonism to the public service. And so I just wonder if you see an actual a possibility for a truce between conservatives and the state capacity that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask the average public servant in Ontario, they would probably agree that they would be a lot more proud of their jobs if the outcomes were measurably better for the province. I don't think that, my version of conservatism is not privatize everything. It's not cut the public service at all cost. It's demand outcomes that are reasonable outcomes, demand outcomes that are respectful of the money we're spending on these things, whether it's on day-to-day services we get from the province or major infrastructure projects. And I think that you would find many public servants would agree with that sentiment, that if you work at Metrolinx, you probably are the first and most frustrated about the outcomes on the Eglinton LRT project. I don't think it is controversial to say that project could have been managed differently. And luckily, I think, the Ontario line is a good example where now we've learned lessons from mistakes on prior infrastructure projects that I suspect are not being remade. And that also goes to show that
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, but we can improve the public service by continuously investing in these things. So, Metrolinx gets better the more infrastructure projects we build because it's not a 1 in 50-year infrastructure project. Now we'll take these on more frequently, and you'll maintain more institutional knowledge, more expertise in-house. And I think that just makes the agency stronger and it makes the province stronger because we get more quality infrastructure at lower cost.
Matt, we're going to keep an eye on what Project Ontario has up its sleeve, and we thank you for coming into TVO tonight to talk to us about it. Not at all. Great to have you. That's Matt Spoke, Project Ontario. So we will give JMM a chance to switch seats with Matt, and then we'll come back with issue 2. Premier Doug Ford has been vocal in his support for new mining projects in Ontario's north, most particularly around the Ring of Fire in the remote northwest. After last February's election, the government introduced Bill 5, which makes it easier and faster to get mines opened. However, it's also sparked a backlash from some Indigenous communities who claim their rights are being sacrificed in the pursuit of economic expediency. Ford then got into some very treacherous territory when he made what he now acknowledges were some very ill-advised comments about Indigenous people. Doug Ford.
We're giving them $3 billion, with a B, $3 billion to be equity partners to make their communities more prosperous and wealthier. This is like handing an opportunity on a silver platter to First Nations that by the way, I have treated like gold. There's going to be a point that you can't just keep coming hat in hand all the time to the government. You got to be able to take care of yourselves. And when you literally have gold mines, nickel mines, every type of critical mineral that the world wants, and you're saying, no, I don't want to touch that. By the way, give me money. Not going to happen.
That cap in hand comment was not particularly well received in Indigenous communities. The NDP MPP, Saul Mamakwa, who is Indigenous, expressed deep offense at the Premier's comments, and he responded on behalf of Indigenous people everywhere. Saul Mamakwa.
As First Nations, we are not beggars. We don't need those type of comments from a Premier. And today I would ask for his apology for those comments, those racist comments. I ask because not as an individual, not as First Nations, but also, for the people of Ontario.
So Mamakwa also said that he believes the Premier has a fundamental lack of understanding around the treaty relationships. Just for context here, treaties are legally binding agreements between Indigenous communities and the Crown. Some of the treaties in Canada date back to before there was a federal or provincial government, and governments are bound by what's called the duty to consult. Right, this is a legal, constitutional obligation. The government cannot legislate away Indigenous rights. Of course, that isn't to say that legislation can't negatively affect Indigenous rights, which is what we are talking about right now, right? Insofar as the province has a case to make here, I think unquestionably not made terribly well by the Premier, it is true that while First Nations have a right to be consulted, particularly when we're talking about projects that are in their traditional territories, and that consultation has to be meaningful engagement. The Supreme Court has said that it can't be like a box-ticking exercise, right? The Supreme Court has also said that Indigenous people do not have the ultimate power to say no. They don't have a veto over projects that would otherwise be approved by a federal or provincial government.
Well, we should point out that the comments landed very badly this week, as Sol Mamakwa pointed out, and as a result, Doug Ford did offer an apology on Thursday, a full-throated apology, which was accepted by the chiefs that he met with at the time. Let's take a look at that. Doug Ford.
I get passionate because I want to help people. That's what it is. And I speak from the heart. And sometimes my words don't come out properly, which I think you've all seen over a number of years. But I'm never too shy to go up and say, my words that came out yesterday, this is what I'm trying to do, is prosperity. And I sincerely apologize if that has offended anyone.
Permission to get on a soapbox for a moment.
Permission granted.
So this whole dispute is happening because the province wants more mineral exploration and exploitation in the north. I use exploitation just purely in a sort of economic term there. That is, in turn, being driven in large part by the dreams that the provincial and federal governments have about developing a major EV sector in the continental auto market. We need these minerals to build batteries and other critical electronics, and we are really hoping that Ontario can be the supplier for not just the North American market, but ideally the world, right? So far, the auto sector in this province has been promised something like $30 billion in subsidies, massive tariff protections that they are currently enjoying from Chinese automobiles that are hurting other Canadian export sectors like agriculture as we speak, all on the promise that someday the auto sector will be able to deliver EVs that consumers can actually buy. They have not delivered an automobile that consumers can buy yet. That is not even mentioning the multiple previous rounds of bailouts and subsidies that the auto sector in this province has received. So, look, the Premier has apologized. The apology has been accepted. I won't belabor that further, but I will say that there are lots of people who come to Queen's Park cap in hand asking for money, often billions of dollars of money, and somehow the Treasury has never closed to them.
Very fair point to make. I do want to talk about the politics of this for
Yes.
a moment, in particular for the Premier, because as he pointed out, he does have a habit over the years of saying things that on further reflection he may want to take back. Unlike a lot of politicians who, on certain circumstances, will double down when they do a dumb thing, this Premier actually doesn't do that. He does come out, he does apologize. Often it's, a day or two later once he's had a chance to get some advice from a lot of people who've suggested to him, Premier, you may want to rethink that. And voters, I think, tend to cut him a lot of slack because of that. But here is the point, and I want to just pick up on the point that you made earlier here and just embellish on it a little more. Our understanding of these issues has to go back more than 5 or 10 years. Yes, there are good and important reasons to try to exploit the critical minerals that are in the Ring of Fire and elsewhere to help Ontario prosper. And yes, there are many Indigenous groups that are actually keen to participate in those projects and share in the bounty that may emerge. But history goes back more than 10 years.
Yes.
In this case, it goes back hundreds of years, as you point out, to before times when Canada was actually Canada. When the Crown made agreements, the power of the Crown made agreements with the ancestors of today's First Nations, and successive representatives of the Crown, namely our governments, have not necessarily been particularly enthusiastic about fulfilling those obligations. These are signed treaties that need to be respected. I mean, either we are a province, a country of laws, or we're not. And I think we are, and I think we should be. So at the end of the day, let's get all sides to the table. Let's figure this out. Let's make sure we come to agreements that everybody can be happy with so that everybody wins. That's not that controversial to say, I don't think.
No, and we know what it looks like when things go very badly, right? We are still dealing with the both environmental and legal and financial impacts of grassy narrows. People, if they were already going long, so I will say that if people don't know about that, they should just Google it. It's a very long and sad story, and Ontario is up to its neck in responsibility for that one. So it is not. We have a history of putting economic progress ahead of Indigenous rights, and it's not a great one. So
now let me do a little segue here, because while we're on the subject of the Premier having said things that he then thought he needed to apologize for, perhaps along with the events of the past week, what would be at the top of the list would be the Greenbelt.
Yes.
And, well, there was some developments on that file this week. Why don't you bring us up to speed?
There was indeed. The Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario released a report last week that included new details on the investigations into the Greenbelt scandal. Doug Ford's staff were using code words to talk about the Greenbelt deal that would have benefited some developers to the tune of $8 billion. Here is what the Premier had to say about the revelation that his staffers were using code words.
Well, they need to follow the rules. And that's as simple as that. They don't follow the rules, they're held accountable. People don't, can I tell you something? People don't give two hoots about this Greenbelt. That's done, that's gone, and we're moving forward with it. But it doesn't even, when we do our polling, it doesn't even show up.
People don't give two hoots about the Greenbelt?
Well, I think some people give many hoots about this. You and I have devoted many a hoot on this podcast. And like the RCMP seem to give at least a hoot and a half. Maybe we can round that up to two hoots,
Okay. Well, let's stop counting hoots for a second and tell us what the Information and Privacy Commissioner actually had to say.
So as somebody who learned how to use computers with an old command line interface, this like really hit me in my deep nerdy core. I was very intrigued by this. So the government, the commissioner found that the government broke its legal obligation in terms of keeping records of their actions. Staffers were using code words like GB or G to refer to this Greenbelt deal that they were looking to push through. They were also, though, and this is where we get to the computer nerdy bit, they were using G with 2 asterisks. And if you know anything about like old, doing directory searches on an old DOS computer, or even now if you use asterisks when you do searching, what it means is it will capture everything with the letter G in it. And so it functionally makes it impossible to search for things like emails and other government documents that would be relevant to a freedom of information request. And on top of that, the commissioner also suggested that some emails might have been permanently deleted, which is also a no-no. So Privacy Commissioner Patricia Kosame said that while these practices occur, it greatly affects government transparency and hurts public trust.
Which may add up to more than a couple of hoots at the end of the day.
Just maybe.
It may. Now, the official opposition at Queen's Park is, of course, hoping that this may spur wider RCMP investigation and or involvement. What do they want to see?
Right. NDP leader Marit Stiles has said that they are tapping the RCMP's Sensitive and International Investigations Unit, which deals with complaints related to elected officials. Of course, the NDP has no power to directly influence the investigation, but they are asking the RCMP to include this as part of their ongoing investigation. Again, just to remind our listeners that the government is currently subject to an RCMP investigation about all this. Stiles said that opposition parties have run out of their own channels to investigate the scandal. They've used all of the levers they can pull at Queen's Park. So they are using the various commissioners and auditors and making their appeals to the RCMP for these types of things. She's also repeated the request for a public inquiry into this whole affair. The government controls whether a public inquiry is called, and I think you could just assume that's not going to happen under this current government.
I'm not sure. I think there's a line about snowballs in hell or something like that that probably comes to mind right now. Anyway, well, we're going to keep an eye on this as the events warrant. And with that, we're off to issue 3. It's been 14 years since shovels hit the ground on the Eglinton Crosstown LRT project, which goes west to east, east to west across the middle of Toronto. Now we are hearing that the keys to the line have been handed over to the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission. So what does this effectively mean?
Right. So just a refresher that the Crosstown is one of the public-private partnerships that was in vogue under the Liberal government. It is being built, or has been built, by a private consortium. It will be owned by the provincial government, but it will be the TTC that operates it. And so this week we have learned that the TTC is finally getting the keys to the thing, and they we believe that they've been training drivers on how to run these trains, and they're going to spend a few months sort of shaking it down and making sure that everything works. Metrolinx's interim president and CEO, Michael Lindsay, told reporters earlier this week that the TTC had, in fact, been handed control of the LRT about a week ago. So, they are now really in control of the movement of trains on the line. As I've mentioned before, if you have traveled along Eglinton for the last few months, you might have actually seen a train on those tracks, but that's been Metrolinx operating things. Now the TTC is going to be responsible for running them and doing those test runs and training up their drivers. When they are ready to move ahead, there will be a period of formal trial running for about 2 weeks, and then what's called a month-long revenue service demonstration. No passengers will actually be on board the trains during that time. They are also integrating some of the lessons that were learned from the Ottawa LRT, which is that's the context for why this, or at least part of the context for why this has taken so long. The Ottawa LRT had a very bad opening, and then eventually a derailment that the province very much does not want to repeat in Toronto. So lots of testing, lots of I's being dotted and T's being crossed as they move towards an eventual opening.
I have an important follow-up question.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen any sinkholes yet? You think we're sort of kidding here, but the folks in Ottawa know well that one of the biggest problems they had there was a sinkhole, like the earth literally collapsed.
It is almost biblical in
how... It truly was, how cursed that thing was. But we haven't seen any sinkholes yet.
No, I have not seen any sinkholes yet.
Okay, very good.
Now, do we knock on wood?
I know Premier Ford did say that he expected the LRT to open, finally, in September.
Yes. I
assume he means September 2025.
Yeah, yes, one hopes at this point. The TTC, as we say, that they still have stress testing to do before what they call revenue service will begin, hopefully in September of this year. This takes time. It feels cruel to ask people to be patient because, of course, Toronto has been patient about this long delayed project. There is, of course, we are a northern city, and they might open it in September when we still maybe have the last little bits of nice, pleasant, sunny weather. Yeah. And then winter is going to come, because winter is always coming in the city. And it might be a particularly nasty winter. And the one concern that they have is that the line might open in September. And then if we get walloped with a bad snowstorm, parts of the crosstown are underground, but particularly in the East End, it's a surface LRT. And so they will have to deal with weather just as surely as buses and streetcars do in Toronto currently. So we will have to make sure that everybody is all trained up for that thing that every other Canadian knows as winter, but sometimes Toronto seems to forget. And we will see if we get that fall opening, in fact.
Well, in fairness, our winters are not as bad as Ottawa's winters, and Ottawa's winters really did put the kibosh on their LRT for quite a while.
It's true, yeah. The Ottawa LRT seemed to, I sincerely, I don't want to keep dumping on the Ottawa LRT, but at one point it was closing both for being too cold in the winter and also getting too hot in the summer. And I was born in Ottawa. I still think fondly of the city of my birth, but that feels to me like somebody got something badly wrong.
Okay. Fingers and toes crossed, and in the meantime, we're off to your column, my column. And time now for our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns that we wrote for our website, tveo.org, over the past week. You can check them out there. What What do you want to start with today?
Well, on the topic of our first item this week of some Tory on Tory criticism, we're also seeing liberal on liberal criticism this week. The New Leaf Liberals, they are a group of liberals getting organized to challenge Bonnie Crombie at the next Liberal annual meeting in September. That annual meeting will, the party constitution requires that Crombie face a leadership review motion. We still don't know what the precise wording of the motion will be, but it will basically be like, should Bonnie Crombie stay on as leader, yay or nay? The New Leaf Liberals are saying, they are asking for two major concessions. They want Crombie to agree to resign if she doesn't clear a 2/3 majority in support. The party constitution would only require her to formally win 50% plus one. Past leaders have generally wanted a much stronger showing than that. So 2/3 is not an insane demand given the history, but
unconstitutional, but not insane.
Yes, exactly. The other request that they are making, and there's already been some evolution on this since we published the piece on Tuesday. The other request they were making was that they didn't want the delegates to this annual meeting to be handpicked by the leader. I go into this a bit in the piece, but basically there was a concern that this is a delegated meeting, and I know how much you miss the delegated leadership conventions. This is not quite that, but it will be a delegated meeting, and there was some concern that the leader's office might be able to ensure that her supporters got first dibs on the delegate slots. As I say, people can go on the website and read the full thing. I will point out that at least some of the people who are behind the New Leaf Liberals are also supporters of Nate Erskine-Smith. They say, when I asked Erskine-Smith, the MP for Beaches East York and one-time challenger in the last Liberal leadership race, he is not behind this. They are not involving him in any way. But certainly, I know some of Crombie supporters are casting a skeptical eye to these claims. Mm-hmm. And what did you write about this?
I want to stick with the Ontario Liberals, actually, because I want to go back to a time when it was a much better time to be a Liberal in the province of Ontario. They weren't in third place. They actually ended up in first place 40 years ago. This past Wednesday, something happened at Queen's Park that was really quite extraordinary. The minority government of the day lost a confidence vote, and they were swept from power, and another party took over without an election. Yes. Now, I couldn't remember the last time that had happened before that. It sure didn't feel like it happened in my lifetime, but I wanted to check. So I called up Jessica Shepherd, who's one of the really fine researchers at the Ontario Legislative Library at Queen's Park, and she did her usual excellent fact-checking. And in fact, that had not happened since 1871.
Wow.
And I did not cover it, just to confirm. What am I referring to? Okay, the election was on May 2nd, 1985. The Tories, and here I'm going to stand up and just show you, Frank Miller succeeded Bill Davis. He was the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party at the time. The results of the election came in, and it was basically a tie. The Tories won 52 seats under Miller. David Peterson won 48 seats, so only a difference of 4 seats. But Peterson got more votes than Miller. There was 38% total vote for Peterson, 37% total vote for Miller, which left it to the leader of the NDP, the third place party, Bob Rae, now, of course, our United Nations ambassador, to be the kingmaker. And Mr. Rae said, I will have negotiations with both Liberal delegations and PC delegations, and whoever we think makes the best deal for the people of Ontario, we will pick them. And of course, he backed David Peterson. They had the confidence vote. The Tories lost. Miller became the last Tory leader in a 42-year-long Tory dynasty. That's a very long time. We had a smooth transfer of power. I have to say, everybody acted reasonably responsibly. And a week later, the Liberals were sworn in, which I'll talk about more next week. Now, it's also a fact that there were some Tories, including Mr. Miller for a while, who said, this all stinks. Right. This is not kosher. There is something unconstitutional about a second-place party becoming the government when we, the Tories claimed, won the most seats and we should have the right to be the government of the day. That, of course, is irrelevant. Under almost all circumstances, you get to govern if you can command the confidence of the House.
Yes.
And the second place party, backed by the NDP, commanded the confidence of the House. In other words, they could get their program through. They could have the majority of the votes on their side. David Peterson met with the lieutenant governor. He said, look, I've got this deal with Bob Rae. We have negotiated an accord of items that we all agree on. I can command the confidence of the House for 2 years. So Mr. Lieutenant Governor, John Blackyeard, you don't have to call another election. Just tell Frank Miller he's got to move seats to the opposition side. I can come into the government side and we can just continue.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And it brought to an end one of the most successful political dynasties anywhere certainly in Canadian history, but maybe anywhere in the world. We used to joke at the time at Queen's Park that there were two unbeatable dynasties, the Ontario Tories and Enver Hoxha's Communist Party in Albania. That was the line. 1943 to 1985 in the province of Ontario. Frank Miller was the last PC premier in the dynasty. He left office 40 years ago this week. That's why I'm wearing his T-shirt today. Interestingly enough, Premier Peterson, in I think a decent act of generosity, appointed Frank Miller to be a kind of special economic ambassador for the province of Ontario. He was a successful businessman, Mr. Miller. And in fact, one of his many jobs over the years was to sell cars. And he was very good at it. He was so good at it that he, a kind of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher conservative, managed to sell a car to Stephen Lewis, who was the leader of the Ontario NDP in the 1970s and who was a pretty left-wing New Democrat.
Yeah.
So, you got to be a pretty good salesman if you can sell that kind of a car to that kind of a person. Mr. Miller did make a kind of political comeback of sorts. After losing the premiership, he actually became the district chair for the municipality of Muskoka. So he had kind of a second act in politics, which was kind of neat. He died, 25 years ago, in the year 2000. His son, Norm Miller, became an MPP after him, and he served as the member for Parry Sound, Muskoka at Queen's Park for almost 20 years himself. And that's the story behind why I'm wearing this T-shirt today.
Very nice.
Now, with that, let's go to the mailbag, and we take your emails, of course, at onpolitics@tvo.org. What do we got this week, JMM?
We have an email from Whitney Holmes in Lakefield, Ontario, who writes, Hey, Steve and JMM. On Friday, June 13th, Steve wore a Kathleen Wynne t-shirt and talked about her significance as the first female leader and premier. While I appreciate noting what you did, you missed the very important note that she was the first 2S LGBTQIA leader of a party and premier as well. Especially since it is Pride Month, this was an omission that should have been included. Whitney from Lakefield, Ontario.
Whitney, I am going to say you are 100% right. I'm glad you wrote because it is June, it is still Pride Month, and it does give us the opportunity to mention that this week. I'm trying to think of why I neglected to mention it last week. Certainly Premier Wynne has taken a lot of justifiable pride in being the first ever female premier.
Yes.
If you go to the second floor of Queen's Park and you look at all the portraits of all of the former premiers, there's 24 white men and her. Yes. So she does stand out. She is different. She made history. It is also true to say that Premier Wynne has never particularly thought of herself as having gotten into public life to be a champion for LGBTQ issues.
Yes.
We do have to remember that what got her into politics in the first place was actually her, thorough disgust with the Mike Harris government and the education reforms it was making. So she ran to become a trustee for the Toronto Board initially, which she won, and then she moved over to Queen's Park in 2003. So it was education that actually got her in.
Yeah.
But it is certainly fair to say that the issue of sexual orientation ought to be a significant part of her resume, a part of her legacy, because, well, I'll tell you what, I will never forget, and I'll never forget it because it was the best convention speech I've ever heard in my life. And I've covered a bunch of leadership conventions over the years. I've probably heard 100 convention speeches if you consider all the candidates who've given them in running for the leadership of their party. Kathleen Wynne gave the best one I ever heard. And it was something like, she talked about a lot of different issues, and then she basically, as Robert F. Kennedy used to say, if you've got a problem, shine a lantern on it. Yeah. She wasn't going to, downplay this issue. She knew it was a concern for some delegates in the Liberal Party, and she basically said, are we really at a place in the 21st century where if you are a member of the LGBTQ community, you are somehow disqualified from being successful in running for the leadership of our party? I hope not, was the message to the delegates, and I have no doubt that speech, because it was so powerful, moved delegate votes on the convention floor that day and helped her win. So, Whitney, thank you for bringing that to our attention, and we are happy to add it to the Premier's list of accomplishments.
And I do want to add one other thing about that speech, which I always remember, because I remember I was watching it at home, and I remember cackling because she had a great line. The Premier had a great line, or I guess the Premier-to-be, from earlier in the speech. It started off with something like, we've got to address the elephant in the room. I know lots of people are talking about it, and yes, I have to acknowledge I am an MPP from Toronto or something like that.
Yes.
And it's funny in retrospect, but like that was one of the other big knocks against her in the leadership campaign at the time was like, okay, fine, she might be a lesbian, but she's also from Toronto, and that was making
was
liberals
worse.
as squeamish as the other thing.
Well, we've had very, 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 very few premiers who represented Toronto ridings. Kathleen Wynne was one. Doug Ford obviously is one.
Yeah.
Bob Rae was one. And people are going to have to help me if as I try to think of another one. I'm not talking about GTA because Bill Davis was Brampton, got the Davis reference in, but for the 416, how many premiers have we had from the 416?
I don't know. I was scouring.
I think
my
that's
brain.
it.
And I mean, it's funny also in retrospect, like given that was such an undertone of her leadership bid at the time, but it's now been 12 years, and we've there've been only 2 premiers, but like for 12 years straight, the Premier of Ontario has represented a Toronto riding, and.
Which does not happen.
No,
it has not happened.
Has not
before.
happened.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, you want to give the email address and we'll get out of here?
Right. Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, June 20th, 2025.
You can follow our shows on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it. Good, bad, or indifferent, write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced by Matthew O'Mara and Preeti Bhuyan, editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president of programming and content.
We always like to finish off by thanking our wonderful studio crew for making the video podcast happen. So thanks, gang. Great to have you here. We've got our season finale next Friday. One more program for the end of June. And until then, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.